The afternoon light through the common room windows had turned honey thick, the kind that made dust motes visible in their slow descent. Albus Potter sat in the alcove by the easternmost window, his Transfiguration textbook open across his lap. Though his eyes had drifted from the page some minutes ago. Outside, the ground stretched toward the forbidden forest, the tree line dark against September sky. Behind him, James's voice carried easily across the room. He was telling some story Albus had missed the beginning, that involved a bludger, 2 Hufflepuff chasers, and what sounded like a borrowed broomstick. Laughter erupted at intervals. James had that gift, that ease with people that made them lean in, made them want to be part of whatever he was part of. Albus turned a page he hadn't read. The parchment made a soft sound against his fingertips. A third year walked past, glanced at him, glanced away. Albus knew that look, the slight pause, the assessment, the inevitable comparison. He'd learned not to meet those looks directly. It was easier that way. The common room smelled of old leather and the particular staleness that accumulated in enclosed spaces filled with teenagers. Someone had left a half-eaten apple on the mantelpiece. The fire crackled intermittently, not yet needed for warmth, but lit anyway, because it always was, because this was Gryffindor Tower, and the fire was always going. "Al, you coming to dinner?" Albus looked up. One of James's friends, Ravi maybe, stood at the edge of the alcove. "In a bit," Albus said. Ravi nodded and moved away, rejoining the group heading toward the portrait hole. James glanced back, caught Albus's eye for a moment, and something passed between them. Not quite concern, not quite invitation. Then James turned and continued his story, and the moment dissolved. The fat lady's portrait swung closed behind them. Her voice drifted back, something about punctuality and proper deportment, the same remarks she made several times daily. Albus returned to his book. Chapter 7. Intermediate Transformations of Inanimate Objects. He'd read this chapter twice already. The words arranged themselves into familiar patterns without quite penetrating into meaning. The castle shifted around him, that constant subtle movement that everyone stopped noticing after the first week. Somewhere above, a staircase was changing position with its low grinding sound. Portraits murmured to each other along the walls. A suit of armor on the landing creaked as it adjusted its stance. Albus closed the book eventually and stood. The common room had mostly emptied. A pair of second years worked on star charts at a corner table, heads bent close together, whispering corrections to each other's work. He made his way down to the great hall, taking the long route that avoided the main corridors. The walls here were older stone, less polished by generations of passing students. A portrait of a medieval knight dozed in his frame, snoring softly. The library occupied the western section of the 3rd floor, its tall windows currently admitting the same honey-colored light that had filled Gryffindor Tower. Rose Weasley sat at her usual table, 3rd row, eastern side, beneath a window that didn't look directly into the afternoon sun. Her potions essay lay before her, already longer than the assigned length. She'd reorganized it twice. The introduction still didn't feel right. Around her, the library breathed with its particular quiet, not silence exactly, pages turning, quills scratching, the occasional whisper between study partners, but a contained hush that felt almost physical. Madame Pince moved between the stacks, with her characteristic disapproving expression, correcting a spine here, adjusting a misshelved volume there. Rose dipped her quill and crossed out a sentence, rewrote it, crossed it out again. That one was better the first way. She looked up. Scorpius Malfoy stood at the end of her table, his own bag slung over one shoulder. He looked like he'd been about to walk past, then reconsidered. "Maybe," Rose said. He hesitated, then nodded and continued on to a table near the restricted section. Rose watched him settle in, extracting books with careful precision, arranging them in a specific order before beginning to read. They'd been in classes together for 3 weeks now. 5th year. OWLs looming. Everyone seemed to be feeling the pressure differently. Rose felt it as a constant low hum of anxiety, a voice that catalogued everything she didn't know, everything she hadn't studied yet, everything she might fail to understand. She returned to her essay. The words felt increasingly distant from what she'd meant to say. Madame Pince's footsteps approached, paused. Rose tensed slightly, but the librarian moved on without comment. The potions essay met minimum standards of neatness and organization. That was apparently sufficient. Through the windows, the light shifted, incrementally, as the sun lowered. Rose checked the tiny watch her parents had given her. Nearly dinner time. She should eat. She should also finish this paragraph. She should probably start the Transfiguration homework as well. The castle bells chimed in the distance, marking the hour. Around the library, students began gathering their materials with various degrees of reluctance. Rose allowed herself 5 more minutes, then carefully blotted her essay and placed it in her bag. On her way out, she passed Scorpius's table. He was still reading, apparently unaware that the dinner hour had arrived. She paused, considered saying something, decided against it. But he looked up as she passed, and their eyes met briefly before they both looked away. Scorpius had become adept at walking through Hogwarts as though he belonged there. The trick was to maintain steady pace, not hurried. That suggested anxiety, not too slow. That invited attention, head up but not challenging, eyes forward but aware of periphery. It was a careful performance he'd refined over 4 previous years. The corridor from the library to the Great Hall took him past a series of portraits whose occupants had known his grandfather. They didn't speak to him, but he felt their gazes track his movement. A witch in Tudor dress whispered something to her neighbor. An elderly wizard in the next frame turned deliberately away. Scorpius kept walking. The staircase near the charms corridor was in an odd position this evening, connecting at an angle that required careful footing. He navigated it automatically, his attention on the stone beneath his feet, the worn places where countless students had stepped before him. A group of 3rd years passed going the other direction, their conversation stopping briefly as they registered who he was, then resuming in lower tones after they'd passed. Scorpius didn't turn to look. The great hall opened before him with its familiar vastness. Floating candles drifted in there, slow patterns overhead. The house tables stretched in their 4 long rows, already mostly filled with students. Conversation created a low roar that echoed against the enchanted ceiling, currently showing early evening sky, clouds catching the last pink light. Scorpius found a space at the Slytherin table toward the middle, neither prominently positioned nor obviously isolated. He served himself potatoes and chicken, eating with methodical attention. Around him, his housemates talked and laughed and passed serving dishes. He existed adjacent to their conversations without quite being part of them. Across the hall, he could see Rose Weasley at the Gryffindor table, sitting with a group of fifth-year girls. She was listening more than speaking, occasionally nodding at something said. Further down the table, James Potter held court with the Gryffindor Quidditch team, gesturing broadly with his fork to illustrate some point. Scorpius ate his dinner and tried not to appear like he was watching anyone. The enchanted ceiling darkened as real evening approached outside. The floating candles brightened in response, their light warming from afternoon gold to evening amber. Hugo Weasley had tried 3 different groups before settling at the end of the Gryffindor table with a cluster of fourth years who seemed willing to tolerate his presence. He'd started dinner sitting with Rose, but she'd been reading between bites, and the other fifth-year girls were discussing something he didn't understand about ancient runes homework. Then he'd moved to sit near some of his own yearmates, but they'd been deep in discussion about something that had happened during a class he hadn't attended. The fourth years were talking about the upcoming Hogsmeade weekend. Hugo contributed when appropriate, laughed at jokes, passed the pumpkin juice when someone needed it. He was good at fitting in. Not quite in, but near enough. "Hugo, your brother's still doing that thing with the dung bombs?" one of the fourth years asked. "That was James Potter," Hugo corrected. Yeah, we're cousins, but..." Right. You're Rose's brother." "Yeah." The conversation moved on. Hugo ate his dinner and tried to decide if he should attempt another joke or stay quiet. Staying quiet seemed safer, but also made him feel invisible. Attempting jokes made him feel too visible, especially when they didn't land properly. The house elves had prepared treacle tart for dessert. Hugo took a piece and ate it slowly, making it last. Albus arrived at dinner late, when most students had already finished eating. The Gryffindor table had largely emptied, with only scattered groups remaining. He found a space and served himself quickly, not particularly hungry, but aware he should eat. James and his friends had moved on already, probably to the common room or the grounds if the weather held. The great hall felt quieter in their absence, the conversation less animated. Albus ate without tasting much. Chicken, vegetables, a roll that had gone slightly cold. The enchanted ceiling showed full evening now, stars beginning to appear against deep blue. He became aware that Hugo was sitting further down the table, alone with his dessert, looking like he wasn't sure whether to stay or go. Albus considered calling out to him, inviting him to sit closer, but Hugo stood before Albus could decide, gathering his things and heading toward the entrance hall. The castle had fully transitioned into evening now. The corridors would be lit with torches, the common rooms filling with students avoiding homework. Albus should probably return to Gryffindor Tower. He had herbology homework still unfinished. Instead, he sat for a few more minutes in the emptying hall, listening to the ambient sounds of ending dinner, house elves beginning to clear the tables, a few portraits along the walls resuming their eternal arguments. The distant sound of students in the entrance hall, heading various directions. Finally, he stood and made his way toward the doors. As he passed through the entrance hall, he felt suddenly cold, a chill that seemed to come from the corridor leading toward the dungeons. He paused, looking down that hallway. The torchlight flickered oddly, shadows moving in patterns that didn't quite match the flame movement. Albus stared for a moment, then shook his head and continued toward the stairs. Hogwarts was full of odd drafts and strange light. It meant nothing. The Gryffindor common room had filled during dinner. Albus navigated to his dormitory, grateful for the relative quiet. His roommates weren't back yet. He could hear them somewhere below, their voices carrying up through the tower. He sat on his bed and pulled out the herbology assignment. 2 feet of parchment on the properties of venomous tentacula. He'd barely started. Outside the dormitory window, night had fully arrived. The grounds were dark except for the lights from Hagrid's hut and the distant glow of the Forbidden Forest's edge. Stars scattered across the visible sky. Albus dipped his quill and began to write. The scratch of nib on parchment created a small rhythm. He worked steadily for an hour, filling the required length with acceptable, if uninspired content. His roommates returned eventually, loud with some joke being extended beyond its natural lifespan. They changed for bed, still laughing. Albus finished his homework, blotted it carefully, and set it aside to dry. He changed into his nightclothes and got into bed while the others were still settling. The dormitory gradually quieted. Someone snored softly. Another mumbled something incoherent from dream. The curtains around Albus's bed blocked most of the light from the dying fire in the common room below. Albus lay awake, listening to the castle settle into its nighttime sounds. The distant creak of stairs moving, wind against windows, the building's constant, almost imperceptible breathing. He thought about the cold corridor, the strange flicker of torchlight. Probably nothing. Almost certainly nothing. Eventually, sleep arrived, gradual and unremarkable, and the castle continued its nighttime rhythms around him, indifferent and eternal. The 3rd weekend of term arrived with unexpected warmth, the kind of September day that felt borrowed from summer. Students clustered in the entrance hall after breakfast, showing their permission slips to Filch, who examined each one with his usual suspicion that everyone was somehow attempting to deceive him. Albus stood in line behind a group of Hufflepuff 3rd years, his signed permission slip folded in his pocket. James had already gone ahead with his friends, disappearing down the path toward Hogsmeade in a cluster of 6th-year energy and laughter. Hugo waited somewhere ahead too, though Albus had lost sight of him in the crowd. Next, Filch growled. Albus handed over his slip. Filch held it up to the light from the doorway, squinting at the signature as though expecting to find evidence of forgery. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he waved Albus through. The path to Hogsmeade wound through grounds that still held morning dew in the shadowed places. Other students walked in groups of varying sizes, their conversations carrying on the light breeze. Albus walked alone, maintaining a middle distance that kept him neither obviously isolated nor awkwardly trying to join anyone else's group. The village appeared gradually as the path curved around a low hill. Smoke rose from chimneys. Shop signs swayed slightly in the breeze. Students were already dispersing to various destinations. Honeydukes, Zonkos, the 3 broomsticks. Albus headed toward Honeydukes, without any particular purpose beyond the fact that it was there and expected. The shop was crowded, warm with body heat, and the sugar-sweet smell of countless varieties of candy. He browsed without much interest, eventually purchasing a small bag of Bertie Bott's Every flavor beans simply because it seemed odd to leave without buying something. Back on the street, he stood for a moment, trying to decide where to go next. Most students his age were traveling in pairs or groups, moving with the purposefulness of having plans. Albus had no plans. He began walking toward the far end of the village, where the shops thinned out and the crowds dispersed. Rose had come to Hogsmeade with 3 other Gryffindor girls from her year, though she was already regretting it. They'd spent 40 minutes in Gladrag's wizardwear, examining robes and comparing opinions, with an enthusiasm Rose couldn't quite match. Now they were heading toward the 3 broomsticks, still discussing the relative merits of different fabric weights. The pub was already busy, filled with the particular noise that came from dozens of conversations happening simultaneously in an enclosed space. They found a table near the back, squeezing in between a group of Ravenclaws and what looked like a couple on a date studiously ignoring everyone around them. Rose's friends ordered butterbeer with the excitement of it still being relatively new. Rose ordered the same, though she'd never particularly enjoyed the taste. Too sweet, with an aftertaste that lingered unpleasantly. She drank it anyway, in small sips, while the conversation around her moved through various topics without requiring much input from her. Through the window, she could see students passing on the street. A group of second years pressed their faces against Honeydukes' window. An older couple, probably 7th years, walked hand in hand toward the shrieking shack. Hugo went by with some 4th years, laughing at something one of them had said. "Rose, did you hear?" She turned back to the table. "Sorry, what?" "We were going to go to Scrivenshaft's after this. You coming?" "Actually, I think I might go to Tomes and Scrolls," Rose said. "I wanted to look for—" She paused, unsure what excuse to give. "For some supplementary reading." Her friends exchanged the kind of look that people exchange when they think you can't see them doing it. "Of course you do," one of them said, not unkindly. Rose finished her butterbeer and made her excuses. The relief of being alone again came like cool air after being in an overheated room. Scorpius had come to Hogsmeade with 2 other Slytherins from his year, but they'd split up after Honeydukes with vague plans to meet later. He suspected they'd made other plans they hadn't wanted to mention in front of him. It was fine. He'd expected it. He walked through the village with no particular destination, eventually finding himself near the 3 broomsticks. Through the windows, he could see it was crowded. He should probably go in anyway. Standing alone on the street was more obviously pathetic than sitting alone in a crowded pub. Inside, he found a small table that had just been vacated and ordered a butterbeer from Madame Rosmerta. The pub's warmth and noise created a kind of anonymity. He could sit here and no one would particularly notice him. He was partway through his drink when a group of Gryffindors settled at the next table. Rose Weasley was among them, sitting slightly apart from the others, sipping her butterbeer with an expression that suggested she wasn't enjoying it. Scorpius returned his attention to his own drink, but he remained peripherally aware of the adjacent table, of Rose's occasional contributions to the conversation, of the way she kept glancing toward the window as though planning an escape route. When she stood and made her excuses to her friends, Scorpius found himself standing as well, on impulse he didn't fully understand. He caught up with her, just outside the pub. "Weasley." She turned, surprised. "Malfoy." They stood for a moment in awkward silence. Other students flowed around them on the street. "I was wondering," Scorpius said, "about that potions assignment, the one on strengthening solutions." What about it? I wasn't sure if we're supposed to include the variation that uses Rian blood or just the standard recipe. Rose considered this. I think just the standard. The variation is 6-year curriculum. Right, that's what I thought. Another pause. Someone bumped into Scorpius from behind, a third year who mumbled an apology and kept walking. I was heading to Tomes and Scrolls, Rose said. If you wanted to, they might have a reference that would clarify it. Scorpius nodded. Okay. They walked toward the bookshop in silence that felt slightly less awkward than expected. The shop was quieter than most of Hogsmeade's establishments, with only a few students browsing the shelves. The proprietor nodded at them from behind the counter and returned to his ledger. Rose headed toward the potions section. Scorpius followed, maintaining a respectful distance. She pulled out a standard reference text and flipped through it with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly how such books were organized. Here, she said, turning the book so he could see. It confirms the standard recipe is what's expected for OWLs. Thanks. She closed the book, but didn't immediately return it to the shelf. Are you finding 5th year difficult? She asked, then immediately looked like she regretted the question. Sometimes, Scorpius admitted. The workload is significant. Yes? Rose hesitated, then added, everyone keeps saying it's preparation for OWLs, but it feels more like they're trying to overwhelm us into taking things seriously. Maybe that's the same thing. Rose almost smiled. Maybe. They browsed in silence for a few more minutes. Scorpius found a book on defensive spell theory that looked interesting. Rose examined several texts before selecting a supplementary guide to ancient runes. Outside, the afternoon had progressed toward evening. The temperature was dropping slightly, a reminder that autumn was truly beginning despite the day's warmth. I should probably find my friends, Rose said, though without much conviction. Yeah, me too. They parted ways at the corner near the post office. Scorpius watched her go, then turned toward Zonko's, where he'd agreed to meet the other Slytherins. They probably wouldn't actually be there, but he'd check anyway. James Potter stood in Zonko's, examining a display of new products with genuine enthusiasm. His friends crowded around him, offering opinions on which items were worth purchasing and which were merely gimmicks pretending to be pranks. The instant swamp is good, one of them said. Used it on a classroom last year. What about these? James held up a box of something called screaming yo-yos. Decent for corridors, but they get shut down too fast. Albus entered the shop while James was debating between 2 different varieties of dung bombs. He saw his brother immediately, but hung back, not wanting to interrupt. James glanced over, caught his eye, and waved him forward. Al, what do you think? Original formula or extra strength? For what? Dung bombs. I'm thinking extra strength for the Slytherin common room area, but maybe that's overkill. Probably overkill, Albus agreed, though he had no strong opinion either way. James grinned and selected the extra strength anyway. Sometimes, overkill is the point. His friends laughed. Albus smiled because it seemed expected. One of them nudged James and said something about getting to the 3 broomstacks before it got too crowded. James paid for his purchases, and they headed toward the door. You coming, Al? James asked. In a bit. James hesitated, that same expression from the common room crossing his face. Not quite concern, not quite invitation. Then one of his friends called to him, and the moment passed. "See you back at the castle then." They left in their characteristic burst of energy and noise. The shop felt quieter in their absence. Albus browsed for a few more minutes before leaving without buying anything. Hugo had lost track of the 4th years he'd come with, somewhere between Honeydukes and Zonkos. He'd stopped to look at something in a shop window, and when he turned around, they'd moved on. He tried to catch up but couldn't find them in the growing crowds. Now he wandered alone, trying to look like he had somewhere to be. He considered going to the 3 Broomsticks, but the thought of sitting alone in that crowded space seemed worse than walking the streets. He ended up at the far end of the village, near the Shrieking Shack, where fewer students ventured. The infamous building sat behind its fence, looking exactly as dilapidated as it always had. Hugo knew the story. Everyone knew the story. But from here, it just looked like an old, abandoned house. Bit anticlimactic, isn't it? Hugo turned. Albus stood a few feet away, also looking at the shack. "Yeah," Hugo said. "I always thought it would be scarier, maybe." "Same." They stood together, in comfortable silence. Hugo felt relieved not to have to perform, not to have to try so hard to fit into a conversation. "Lost your friends?" Albus asked. "Sort of." "You?" "Didn't really have any to lose." Hugo glanced at him. "James didn't want you to come." "James doesn't not want me to come. It's just—" Albus trailed off, apparently unable to articulate whatever it was. "Yeah," Hugo said, understanding anyway. They started walking back toward the main part of the village. The sun had lowered considerably, casting long shadows across the street. Other students were beginning the walk back to the castle, the younger ones primarily, though some older students were also heading back. "Want to stop at Honeydukes before we go?" Hugo asked. "Already went." "Me too, but I forgot to get something for Rose. She always shares her stuff from home." They detoured to Honeydukes, which had grown even more crowded as students made last-minute purchases. Hugo selected some chocolate frogs while Albus waited near the door. Through the window, the street was filling with students heading back. The walk back to Hogwarts felt longer than the walk down had been. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the light had taken on that particular quality of early evening, still bright enough to see clearly but unmistakably ending. Various groups of students walked at different paces, spreading out along the path. Albus and Hugo walked together, not talking much, occasionally commenting on something they passed. Rose appeared ahead of them, walking alone with a book-shaped package under one arm. Further ahead, James and his friends were engaged in some kind of relay race that involved passing a Zonko's product back and forth while trying not to drop it. Scorpius walked by himself, off to the side of the main path, maintaining his characteristic measured pace. As they crested the hill that brought Hogwarts fully into view, several students stopped to look. The castle stood against the darkening sky, its windows beginning to light from within. It looked exactly as it always looked, yet someone always seemed compelled to pause and stare as though seeing it for the first time. But something was different. Albus noticed it first, a flicker in some of the windows, a strange quality to the light. Not wrong exactly, but not quite right either. Like the torchlight in the corridor near the dungeons, shadows moving slightly out of sync with their sources. "Do the windows look weird to you?" Hugo asked. "Yeah," Albus said, Relieved, he wasn't the only one seeing it. Rose had stopped as well, staring up at the castle with a slight frown. Further along the path, Scorpius had also paused, his attention fixed on the same windows. James and his friends didn't seem to notice. They continued their game, racing toward the castle entrance with the heedless energy of people who hadn't seen anything unusual at all. The flicker lasted only a moment, then stabilized. The castle looked normal again. Students resumed walking, conversations picking up where they'd left off. But Albus kept glancing back as they approached the entrance. The windows remained normal now, but the wrongness had been there, definite and unmistakable. In the entrance hall, students dispersed to their various common rooms. Filch stood by the doors, counting returning students against some list only he understood. The warmth of the castle after the cooling evening felt welcoming. Albus headed toward Gryffindor Tower with Hugo beside him. Neither mentioned the strange windows. Around them, students chatted about their afternoon in the village, about purchases made and conversations had, and plans for next weekend's trip. Life at Hogwarts continued its normal rhythm, interrupted only by the small, strange moment that already felt less certain in memory. Probably nothing, almost certainly nothing. But as Albus climbed the stairs toward the common room, he felt the same chill he'd felt in the corridor near the dungeons, brief and inexplicable, gone before he could be certain it had been there at all. The third week of October arrived with rain that persisted for days, drumming against windows and turning the grounds into stretches of mud that made outdoor classes miserable. Students moved through corridors in damp clusters, their robes giving off the particular smell of wet wool and accumulated moisture. Albus left potions on Wednesday afternoon with the rest of his class, shuffling toward the stairs in the general flow of students changing lessons. The dungeons always felt colder in rain, the stone walls seeming to absorb and multiply the chill. His class had run late. Professor Slughorn had spent the last 15 minutes telling some story about a former student who'd gone on to invent something important. And now, the corridors were crowded with students from multiple years, all moving at once. Albus let himself be carried along by the current of bodies, then noticed an opportunity to cut through a side corridor that would avoid the worst of the crowd at the main staircase. He slipped sideways, grateful for the momentary space and quiet. The corridor was older than the main passages, its stone less worn by constant traffic. A single torch burned at the far end, its light flickering in a draft that Albus couldn't feel. He'd walked this way before, he thought, though he couldn't remember when. Halfway down, the air changed. It was subtle at first, a heaviness that made breathing feel like work. The temperature dropped several degrees in the span of a few steps. Albus slowed, looking around. The corridor appeared normal. Stone walls, a portrait of a sleeping monk, a window showing grey rain. But the wrongness persisted. The air felt thick, resistant. The torch at the corridor's end guttered lower, its flame pulling sideways despite the absence of wind. Shadows pooled in corners with unusual density. Albus stood still, listening. The distant sound of students in other corridors seemed muted, as though coming from much farther away than was possible. His own breathing sounded too loud in the strange quiet. He should probably go back, rejoin the main corridors. But History of Magic was in the other direction, and he was already late. He forced himself forward, each step feeling like pressing through something that didn't want him there. The sensation ended as abruptly as it had begun. One moment the air was heavy and wrong, the next it was simply normal corridor atmosphere. Cool stone, distant voices, regular drafts. Albus glanced back. The corridor looked entirely ordinary. Even the torch burned steadily now. He continued to History of Magic, arriving 3 minutes late, but not so late that Professor Binns noticed his entrance. He slid into a seat near the back and tried to focus on the lecture, but his attention kept drifting to the memory of that corridor, trying to convince himself it had been nothing unusual. Rose spent her Thursday afternoon free period in the library as she always did. She'd finished her charms homework and moved on to research for an optional transfiguration essay, the kind of extra credit she couldn't resist pursuing even though her grades needed no supplementing. The book she needed was in a section she didn't often visit, past the study tables toward the older collections. The shelves here were darker wood, the volumes more worn. Fewer students came to this area. The books were more obscure, less likely to contain straightforward answers to homework questions. Rose ran her finger along spines, reading titles half aloud under her breath. Advanced Transfiguration Theory, Metamorphic Principles, The Nature of Change, A Philosophical Inquiry. A book near the end of the row caught her attention, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Foundational Protections, A History of Hogwarts Defensive Enchantments. Not relevant to her essay, but interesting. She pulled it out. The book was older than most in the library, its leather cover cracked along the spine. Rose opened it carefully. The frontispiece showed Hogwarts as it had appeared centuries ago, before various additions and modifications. She flipped through pages of dense text describing ward schemes and protective spells. A chapter heading stopped her. Founder-era enchantments, persistent and self-renewing magics. She read the first paragraph. The 4 founders embedded numerous protective enchantments into Hogwarts' very structure, many of which remain active to this day despite the passage of a millennium. Unlike standard ward schemes, which require periodic renewal, these foundational protections were designed to draw power from the castle itself, creating a symbiotic relationship between stone and spell. Of particular note are the responsive enchantments, which activate or intensify based on conditions the founders deemed significant. Rose read further. The text was technical, filled with terminology she only half understood. But the general concept was clear. Certain protections throughout the castle were designed to respond to specific triggers, threats, intrusions, but also more subtle things, emotional states, intentions. The paragraph mentions something about generational resonance, but the explanation grew too complex for her to follow. She checked the book out. Madame Pince gave her a sharp look, but stamped it without comment, and returned to her usual table. Around her, other students worked on their own assignments, the library filled with its familiar sounds of industry and concentration. Rose opened the book again and tried to read more, but her attention kept fragmenting. Through the window, rain continued falling. The light was failing earlier each day now, afternoon already shading toward evening, though it was barely 4 o'clock. She packed up eventually and headed to dinner, the book heavy in her bag. Its weight somehow more than its physical mass should account for. Scorpius had astronomy that night, the last period before curfew. The tower was cold and damp from the rain that had only recently stopped. He climbed the stairs with the rest of his class, their breath visible in the chill air. Professor Sinistra was setting up the telescope array, adjusting angles to account for cloud cover that might or might not clear. If the weather doesn't cooperate, we'll do theoretical work instead, she announced. But let's give it 15 minutes. Students milled about in the cold, pulling their robes tighter. Scorpius stood near the tower's edge, looking down at the castle below. Windows glowed warmly against the darkness. He could see a few students crossing the courtyard far below, tiny figures hurrying to get inside before curfew. "Malfoy, come look at this." He turned. One of his classmates, a Ravenclaw girl named Sarah, was pointing at something near the tower wall. Scorpius crossed over. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Just stone wall, part of the tower's interior structure. Then he noticed the portrait. It was small, easy to miss. A wizard in medieval robes standing in what appeared to be a library. "What about it?" Scorpius asked. "Watch." They watched. The portrait remained still. The wizard didn't move, didn't blink, didn't exhibit any of the usual animation portraits displayed. It looked more like a painting than a portrait, just pigment on canvas, nothing alive within it. "Has he always been like that?" Sarah asked. Scorpius had no idea. He'd probably walked past this portrait dozens of times without really looking at it. But now that he was looking, the stillness seemed wrong. Even sleeping portraits moved slightly, breath, or the occasional twitch. This wizard was utterly immobile. "Maybe he's on a visit," Scorpius suggested, "in another painting." "For how long, though? I noticed this at the start of class. That's 20 minutes now." Professor Sinistra called them back to the telescopes. The clouds had cleared enough to attempt observation. Scorpius returned to his assigned telescope, but he kept glancing at the portrait. The wizard never moved. After class, walking back down the tower stairs with the other Slytherins, Scorpius felt compelled to look back. The portrait was visible from the landing below, and he paused, causing the student behind him to nearly collide with his back. "Sorry," Scorpius muttered, moving aside. But he'd seen what he needed to see. The portrait was still frozen, its occupant locked in whatever stillness had overcome him. Scorpius continued down the stairs, troubled by something he couldn't articulate. It was probably nothing. Portraits were mysterious, their rules obscure. But the wrongness of it stayed with him all the way back to the Slytherin common room. James had Quidditch practice Friday evening, despite the mud and lingering dampness. The team was preparing for their first match of the season against Slytherin in 3 weeks. And their captain insisted on maintaining the schedule regardless of weather. They flew in the grey twilight, running plays until James's arms ached and his robes were thoroughly soaked from repeated contact with mud-slick grass. When the captain finally called practice to an end, they trudged back to the changing rooms in exhausted silence. James showered and changed, grateful for the warm water and clean clothes. Hugo appeared while he was toweling off his hair, standing in the doorway, looking uncertain. "Hey," James said. "What's up?" "Just waiting. Rose is still at dinner. You can come in, you know. You don't have to lurk in doorways." Hugo entered, sitting on a bench, while James finished gathering his things. The changing room still smelled of mud and grass, despite the showers. "How's fourth year treating you?" James asked. "Fine. Good. It's fine." James glanced at him. Hugo had that look he sometimes got, like he was trying to decide whether to say something. James waited, sorting through his bag with unnecessary attention. "Have you noticed anything weird lately?" Hugo asked finally. "Weird how?" "I don't know, just weird, like things being in the wrong place or sounds that don't match up right." James considered this. "Not really. Why?" "No reason. Just wondering." They walked back to the castle together. Full darkness had fallen while James was at practice, the grounds lit only by light spilling from windows and the distant glow of Hagrid's hut. Their footsteps squelched in the muddy grass. "There," Hugo said suddenly, pointing. James looked. A suit of armor stood near the entrance, one of dozens that decorated the castle. It appeared entirely normal. "What about it?" "It moved. I saw it earlier, near the staircases. Now it's here." "Armor moves sometimes," James said. "They shift around. Everyone knows that." "Yeah, but not that far. Not between floors." James looked at the armor more carefully. It did seem unusual for armor to relocate so dramatically, but he'd never paid close attention to which suit stood where. "Maybe you're thinking of a different suit." "Maybe." But Hugo sounded uncertain, and when they entered the entrance hall, he glanced back at the armor with an expression James couldn't quite read. Albus spent Saturday afternoon in the library, ostensibly working on homework, but mostly staring out the window at the grounds, where weak sunlight had finally broken through days of clouds. He should go outside, enjoy the break in weather. Instead, he sat at a table with his herbology textbook open to a page he'd been staring at for 20 minutes. Rose was at a nearby table, surrounded by more books than seemed necessary for any single assignment. She'd been there when Albus arrived and would probably still be there when he left. At some point, Scorpius had appeared, taking a table near the restricted section with his characteristic quiet efficiency. The afternoon stretched on. Students came and went. Madame Pince made her rounds, reshelving books with her usual expression of long-suffering disapproval. The light through the windows shifted incrementally as the sun crossed the sky. Albus finally gave up on herbology and decided to return to Gryffindor Tower. He packed his things and stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder. As he passed Rose's table, she looked up. "Potter." He stopped. "Yeah?" She seemed to struggle with something, then shook her head slightly. "Nothing, never mind." Albus hesitated, but she'd already returned to her books. He continued toward the library entrance, past Scorpius's table where the Slytherin was writing, with careful, measured strokes. In the corridor outside, that same wrongness manifested again. Not as intense as the first time, but unmistakable. The air felt thicker. The light from the torches seemed to pull and stretch in ways light shouldn't move. Albus walked faster, and the sensation faded after a dozen paces. He looked back. The corridor appeared entirely normal. A pair of third years walked past, deep in conversation, showing no signs of noticing anything unusual. Albus continued toward Gryffindor Tower, that persistent doubt growing stronger. Something was happening. Something was wrong with the castle, subtle and spreading. And he was starting to suspect he wasn't the only one who'd noticed. The library was nearly empty by the time evening fully settled on Thursday. Most students had gone to dinner or returned to their common rooms, driven out by the approach of curfew and the particular hunger that came after a day of classes. The few who remained worked with the quiet intensity of those who'd chosen to stay, despite more comfortable options existing elsewhere. Albus sat at a table near the windows, working through a defense against the dark arts essay that refused to come together properly. He'd rewritten the introduction 3 times. Each version felt worse than the last. Outside, darkness pressed against the glass, broken only by the occasional light from a distant window. He wasn't sure why he'd come to the library instead of the common room. The work could have been done anywhere, but something about the common room tonight had felt too crowded, too loud, too insistently social. Here, at least, the quiet felt purposeful rather than isolating. Rose appeared sometime after 7, her arms loaded with the usual excessive number of books. She didn't seem to notice Albus as she passed, heading toward her preferred area near the back. A few minutes later, Scorpius arrived, moving with his characteristic careful neutrality, and took a table 2 rows over. Albus returned his attention to his essay. The torches along the walls burned steadily, their light warm against the surrounding darkness. Madame Pince moved between the stacks on some errand known only to her, the sound of her footsteps a familiar rhythm. The essay still wasn't working. Albus read back over what he'd written and found it adequate but uninspired, the kind of work that would earn an acceptable and nothing more. He crossed out a sentence and tried to rewrite it, but the replacement was no better. He became aware of footsteps approaching. Hugo appeared at the edge of his table, looking uncertain about whether he should interrupt. "Hey," Albus said quietly. "Can I sit?" "Yeah, of course." Hugo sat across from him, pulling out parchment and books with less organization than Rose would have employed. He spread his materials across half the table and stared at them with an expression suggesting he wasn't sure where to start. They worked in silence for a while. The library's quiet wrapped around them, broken only by the scratch of quills, the occasional turn of a page, Madame Pince's distant movements through the stacks. "Do you ever feel like you're missing something?" Hugo asked eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. Albus looked up. "What do you mean?" "Like everyone else knows something you don't, or they're all part of something that you're just adjacent to." "All the time," Albus admitted. Hugo nodded, seeming relieved. He returned to his homework, but with slightly less tension in his shoulders. Rose appeared a few minutes later, approaching their table with a large book under her arm and an expression that suggested she'd been debating whether to come over. "Potter, Weasley." She addressed them both, then seemed unsure how to continue. "Rose," Hugo said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. She glanced around the library, then pulled out the chair next to Hugo and sat. "Have either of you noticed anything strange lately about the castle?" Albus and Hugo exchanged a look. "What kind of strange?" Albus asked carefully. Rose set the book on the table. Foundational Protections, a history of Hogwarts' defensive enchantments. "I found this a few weeks ago. It talks about how the founders built certain protections into the castle structure. Enchantments that respond to specific conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Hugo asked. "Threats mostly, but also other things. The book mentions something called generational resonance, enchantments that activate in response to. I don't fully understand it. Something about patterns repeating across time." Albus felt the pieces beginning to align in his mind. "I felt something in certain corridors, like the air gets heavy and the light looks wrong." "Yes," Rose said, leaning forward. "Exactly like that. When did you first notice it?" A few weeks ago, the corridor near the dungeons, then again in a passage off the main stairs. It's been happening more often. Hugo was nodding. I've felt it too, and I keep seeing things that seem off, like that suit of armor that moved between floors. Armor moves all the time, Rose said, but uncertainly. Not like that, Hugo insisted. Not that far, that fast. They fell silent as Madame Pince walked past, her sharp eyes scanning the tables. She didn't stop, but her presence was a reminder to keep their voices down. After she'd passed, Rose opened the book to a marked page. There's a section here about how the castle's protections sometimes manifest when they sense certain kinds of imbalance. It's not very clear about what that means, but it mentions old wards becoming visible or tangible under specific circumstances. Like when they're activating, Albus asked. Maybe, or when they're being disturbed somehow. Movement drew Albus's attention. Scorpius had stood from his table and was approaching, his expression uncertain but determined. I'm sorry to interrupt, Scorpius said quietly, but I couldn't help overhearing. You're talking about unusual occurrences in the castle. Rose looked at Albus and Hugo, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, she nodded at an empty chair. Sit. Scorpius sat, maintaining his characteristic careful posture. There's a portrait in the astronomy tower. It's been frozen for over a week now. No movement at all, which shouldn't be possible. Portraits don't just stop. I've noticed portrait behavior changing too, Rose said. Not frozen, but reluctant, like they don't want to be in certain parts of the castle. The fat lady complained about a draft last week, Hugo offered. But there wasn't any wind. She kept saying the corridor felt unsettled. They looked at each other, the implications beginning to take shape between them. So we're all experiencing similar things, Albus said. Strange sensations in corridors. Things that seem wrong, but we can't quite explain why. And it's been increasing, Rose added, getting more frequent, more noticeable. Has anyone else mentioned it? Scorpius asked. Other students? Professors? I haven't heard anything, Albus said. The others shook their heads. Maybe we're the only ones noticing, Hugo suggested. Or the only ones who think it's worth mentioning. Or the only ones it's happening to, Scorpius said quietly. That thought settled over them with uncomfortable weight. Rose broke the silence by pulling the book closer, flipping through pages with renewed purpose. There's more in here about responsive enchantments. It says they sometimes activate in the presence of specific individuals. People who, the wording is strange, people who carry resonant traces of catalytic events. She looked up. I think that means people connected to significant magical occurrences. The implications hung in the air. They all understood what that might mean, who they were, whose children they were. But that doesn't explain what's actually happening, Hugo said, or why. No, Rose agreed, but there might be more information elsewhere. If we knew what we were looking for. We could search the library more systematically, Scorpius suggested. Look for references to similar phenomena. Or we could try to find one of the affected areas, Albus said. See if we notice anything when we're all together. Rose closed the book thoughtfully. Both, maybe. Research first, to understand what we might be dealing with, then investigate more directly. When? Hugo asked. They looked at each other, the beginnings of something taking shape. Not quite friendship yet, but a shared purpose that felt like it might lead there. "Tomorrow after classes," Rose suggested. "We could meet here." Nods of agreement. Quiet understanding that they'd crossed some threshold, that whatever came next, they'd be facing it together rather than separately. They met the following evening as agreed, their table in the back corner of the library, becoming an unofficial headquarters. Rose had assembled additional books. Scorpius brought notes from astronomy class where Professor Sinistra had mentioned historical magical disturbances. Hugo contributed observations he'd been writing down, and Albus had a rough map of where he'd experienced the strange sensations. They worked through the early evening, speaking in low voices when they needed to discuss something, otherwise maintaining the library's expected quiet. The research was slow and often frustrating. Most books mentioned protective enchantments only in passing, and the detailed texts were either restricted or written in technical language that required constant reference to other sources. "Here," Rose said eventually, her finger on a passage in a particularly old volume. "Listen to this. The Founder's most complex enchantments were designed not merely to protect, but to heal. When the castle sensed fundamental disruption to its purpose, the education and safety of young witches and wizards, these protections would manifest in ways designed to restore balance." "What kind of disruption?" Albus asked. "It doesn't say specifically, but there's a footnote." She flipped to the back of the book. It references something called the Founder's Mirror, an artifact supposedly created by all four founders working together. "What does it do?" Hugo leaned closer to read over her shoulder. The description is vague, something about reflecting truth and facilitating understanding. But it says the mirror was hidden within the castle's deepest protections to activate only when most needed. "That's remarkably unhelpful," Scorpius observed. "Most magical history is," Rose said. "The really important information was usually kept secret or written in code." They continued reading, but found little else of substance. The evening grew later. Other students who'd been in the library gradually departed. Madame Pince began making pointed sounds about closing time. "We should try to find one of the affected corridors," Albus said as they gathered their materials. "See if being there together makes any difference." "Now?" Hugo asked, glancing at the darkening windows. "Why not? We've still got time before curfew." They checked out the books Rose wanted to keep examining, then left the library together. The castle's evening quiet had settled in that particular stillness that came after dinner when most students were in their common rooms. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floors. Albus led them toward the corridor, where he'd first felt the wrongness, the passage near the dungeons. They walked in loose formation, no one quite sure what they were looking for or expecting to find. The corridor appeared normal at first. Stone walls, flickering torches, a few portraits whose occupants watched them pass with mild interest. But as they continued deeper, the atmosphere began to shift. "Do you feel that?" Rose asked quietly. Albus nodded. The air was thickening, that same heaviness he'd experienced before, but this time it was stronger, more defined. The temperature dropped several degrees. Their breath became visible in small clouds. The torches along the walls began to gutter, their flames pulling sideways despite no apparent wind. Shadows pooled in corners with unusual density, seeming to move independently of the flickering light. "This is definitely not normal," Hugo said, his voice tight. They continued forward slowly. Scorpius had drawn his wand, though he held it carefully at his side rather than raised. The others followed his example. The corridor ended at a door Albus had never noticed before. It was old wood reinforced with iron bands and covered in runes that seemed to shift slightly when looked at directly. The door had no handle, no obvious mechanism for opening. "Has this always been here?" Rose asked. "I don't think so," Albus said. "I've walked this corridor before. I would have noticed." "Should we try to open it?" Hugo asked. "How?" Scorpius moved closer, examining the runes without touching the door. "I don't recognize this script. It's older than standard magical notation." Rose pulled out her wand and cast a simple detection charm. The runes glowed briefly with a pale blue light, then faded. "There's definitely active magic here, strong magic." "What kind?" Albus asked. "I don't know. Protection of some kind, probably. But it's not hostile. It feels more like—" She struggled for the right word. "Like it's waiting." They stood before the door in uncertain silence. The wrongness of the corridor pressed around them, but differently now that they were all together. Less oppressive, almost expectant. "We should probably think about this more," Scorpius said finally. "Research what we're dealing with before trying anything rash." The others nodded, though Albus felt reluctant to leave. Something about the door felt significant, like they'd found what they'd been looking for without realizing they were searching for it. The walk back to the inhabited parts of the castle felt longer than it should have. The wrongness faded gradually, the air returning to normal temperature and weight. By the time they reached the entrance hall, the corridor behind them seemed entirely ordinary again. "Same time tomorrow?" Rose asked. "We need to figure out what that door is and how to open it." They agreed and separated to their respective common rooms, each carrying the weight of their discovery. Albus climbed the stairs to Gryffindor Tower with Hugo beside him, neither speaking, both processing what they'd experienced. The fat lady swung open after Rose gave the password, admitting them to warmth and light, and the comfortable noise of students who hadn't spent their evening discovering impossible doors in hidden corridors. James looked up from where he sat with his friends, caught Albus's eye, and seemed to notice something different, though he didn't comment. Albus settled into a chair by the window, pulling out his homework as camouflage, while his mind continued working through the evening's discoveries. Outside, darkness had fully claimed the grounds. The castle's windows glowed against the night, warm and welcoming and entirely normal. But somewhere in the dungeons, that door waited behind its runes and protections. And whatever it guarded, whatever the founders had hidden there, was beginning to wake. The first week of November brought cold that settled into the castle's bones and refused to leave. Students moved through corridors wrapped in extra layers, their breath visible in the less heated passages. The grounds froze overnight, grass crunching underfoot, the lake's edges beginning to ice over. The five had fallen into routine without explicitly deciding to. They met in the library most evenings, ostensibly studying, but actually researching anything that might explain the door, the disturbances, the sense that something in the castle was waiting for them to understand. Their table in the back corner had become implicitly theirs, other students seeming to recognize it as occupied territory. Rose had assembled a small collection of books on Hogwarts history, protective enchantments, and Founder-era magic. Most were frustratingly vague about specifics, written in the archaic style that prioritized mystique over clarity. Scorpius contributed what he could find about ancient rune schemes. Hugo kept notes of their observations. Albus drew maps of the affected corridors, marking where the wrongness was strongest. They didn't always talk about the door. Sometimes they just worked on actual homework, the comfortable silence of people who'd grown accustomed to each other's presence. But the door was always there, an unspoken weight beneath their conversations. It was during one of these quieter evenings that things began to shift. Rose had been staring at the same page for 10 minutes, her quill hovering above parchment but not writing. Finally, she set both down and rubbed her eyes. "I'm going to fail Transfiguration," she said, so quietly Albus almost missed it. He looked up. "What? You're top of the class." "I got an acceptable on the last essay. An acceptable. Do you know what my mother said when I told her?" The others had stopped their own work, attention drawn by something in Rose's voice. Not quite distress, but close to it. She said it was fine, that one grade doesn't matter. But she said it in that way, you know? That way that means she's disappointed but trying not to show it. Rose laughed, but without humor. "I spent 3 extra hours on that essay. I researched sources beyond the curriculum. And I got an acceptable." "That's still good," Hugo offered. "It's not good enough. It's never good enough." Rose's hands had curled into fists on the table. "Everyone expects me to be her, to understand things instantly, to always have the answer, to revolutionize magical society before I'm 20. And I'm not." The admission hung in the air. Scorpius was the first to speak. "My first detention this year was for answering a question correctly in charms," he said quietly. "Professor Flitwick asked about shield variations. I provided the information, and afterward a 7th-year Gryffindor reported me for showing off inappropriate knowledge. Flitwick had to give me detention to avoid complaints." "That's not fair," Hugo said. "No, but it's expected." Scorpius's expression was carefully neutral. "Every correct answer is proof I think I'm better than everyone else. Every mistake is proof that Malfoys are inherently inferior. There's no middle ground where I'm just a student trying to learn." Albus felt something loosening in his chest, a pressure he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing its weight. "James got picked for Quidditch captain next year. Everyone's talking about how he's following in Dad's footsteps. Natural leader, born for it. And he is good at it. He is all those things." "So?" Rose asked. "So I tried out for the team last year and didn't make reserve seeker. Didn't make the team at all. And I could see it in people's faces. That surprise, that confusion about how Harry Potter's son could fail at something his father excelled at." The words came faster now, years of them building up. "I'm in Gryffindor because the hat knew what everyone expected. But I asked for Slytherin first. Did you know that? I actually wanted Slytherin. Thought maybe there I could just be Albus instead of Harry Potter's disappointment of a second son." "You're not a disappointment," Rose said firmly. "Try telling that to the 3rd years who stare at me in corridors, or the professors who look confused when I don't instinctively understand advanced defensive magic, or James, who tries so hard not to make me feel bad about being better at literally everything. Silence settled over the table. In the distance, Madame Pince was reshelving books with her usual precise efficiency. The library's torches burned steadily, their light warm against the November cold seeping through the windows. "I'm nobody's legacy," Hugo said finally. "That's my problem. Rose is Hermione's daughter. You're Harry's son. James is James. Scorpius has the whole complicated Malfoy history. And I'm just Rose's little brother, who isn't as smart as her, or her mother, or really anyone. I'm not good at magic. I'm not good at Quidditch. I'm not particularly good at anything. I'm just sort of there." "That's not true," Rose said. "Isn't it? Name one thing I'm actually good at. One thing that doesn't end with, but not as good as someone else." Rose opened her mouth, then closed it. The inability to immediately respond said more than words could have. "We're all carrying them, aren't we?" Scorpius said quietly. "Our families, their histories, everything they did, everything they were. We can't just be ourselves. We have to be ourselves in relation to them." "The war," Albus said. "It's always the war. Everything goes back to the war." Rose nodded slowly. "My parents defeated Voldemort. They saved the entire wizarding world. How do you follow that? What could I possibly do that would matter by comparison?" "My family supported him," Scorpius said, his voice carefully controlled. "My grandfather was a Death Eater. My father tried to be better, but the name carries everything they did. Every time I introduce myself, I see people calculating whether I'm trustworthy, whether the darkness is hereditary." "My father died fighting him," Hugo said quietly. "Except he didn't. I mean, Uncle Fred died, and Dad survived. But everyone talks about the sacrifice, the heroism. How do I honor that? How do I live up to someone who was willing to die for what's right when the bravest thing I've done is show up to class?" They sat with that for a long moment. Around them, the library continued its evening rhythms, oblivious to the weight being shared at their corner table. "The castle knows," Rose said suddenly. "That's what's happening. The enchantments, the disturbances, they're responding to us, to what we're carrying." "The book mentioned generational resonance," Albus said. "Patterns repeating across time." "Our parents' war," Scorpius said, understanding dawning. "We're carrying it. The unresolved pieces, the complicated legacy. The castle senses it." "So what does it want us to do?" Hugo asked. Rose pulled out foundational protections and flipped to a marked page. "It says here that the founders designed their deepest protections to heal, not just defend. To restore balance when disruption threatened the castle's purpose, which is educating young witches and wizards," Albus said. "Hard to do that properly when everyone's too busy living up to or living down their parents' legends. Or when old prejudices and divisions keep getting reinforced," Scorpius added quietly. "So the door," Hugo said. "The mirror. That's what it's for. To help us, what, let go of all this?" "Maybe not let go," Rose said slowly, "but to see it clearly. To see each other clearly, without all the distortion that history and expectation creates." They looked at each other across the table. 5 students who'd been shaped by a war they hadn't fought, carrying weight they hadn't chosen, trying to figure out who they could be when the past's shadow finally lifted. "We should go back," Albus said. "To the door. Together." "Now?" Hugo asked. "We've been researching for weeks. I don't think we'll find better answers in books. I think the answers are through that door. Rose hesitated, then nodded. The runes responded to detection charms. They're not hostile. Whatever's behind that door, it's not meant to hurt us. Probably, Scorpia said. Probably, Rose agreed. They gathered their things with the careful slowness of people trying not to seem like they were doing anything unusual. Madame Pince barely glanced at them as they left, too occupied with a group of second years who'd gotten into an argument about proper shelving procedures. The castle's corridors were quiet, but not empty. They passed other students returning from the library or heading to common rooms, careful to look casual, like 5 students taking an evening walk rather than heading towards something they didn't fully understand. The air began to change as they approached the dungeons. That familiar heaviness, but stronger now, more defined. The temperature dropped with each step, their breath misting in increasingly visible clouds. "It knows we're coming," Rose whispered. The corridor appeared ahead of them, torches guttering in their wall brackets. The wrongness pressed around them, but less oppressive than before, almost welcoming in its strange way. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing on cold stone. The portraits they passed were empty, their occupants having fled to other frames. A suit of armor stood perfectly still, frost gathering on its metal surface despite the torch's warmth. The door materialized out of shadow and stone, exactly as they remembered. Ancient wood, iron bands, runes that shifted when looked at directly. But something had changed. The runes glowed faintly now, pale blue light pulsing in a slow rhythm like breathing. They stood before it, 5 students whose families had defined an era, whose names carried weight they hadn't earned and couldn't escape. The door waited, patient and implacable. "Together?" Albus asked. The others nodded. They moved forward as one, and Albus reached out to touch the door's surface. The runes flared bright. The door swung open, silent despite its obvious weight and age. Beyond lay darkness, but not threatening, more like the darkness of a room waiting for light to be brought in. They stepped through together, and the door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. For a moment they stood in complete darkness, unable to see anything, even each other. Then light began to emanate from the walls themselves, a soft glow that built gradually until they could see. The chamber was circular, ancient stone carved with more of the shifting runes. The ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow. And at the center, standing on a raised platform, was a mirror. It was taller than any of them, its frame wrought from what looked like all 4 house metals: gold, silver, bronze, and copper, intertwined in complex patterns. The mirror's surface rippled slightly, like water disturbed by an invisible breeze. "The Founder's mirror," Rose breathed. They approached slowly, warily. The mirror's surface didn't show their reflections. Instead, it showed something else. Fragments of scenes, moments they recognized, and moments they didn't. Harry Potter facing Voldemort. Hermione Granger in the library, younger, surrounded by books. Ron Weasley in battle. Draco Malfoy as a child, looking frightened and alone. Their parents' lives, their parents' war. "It's showing us what we inherited," Scorpius said quietly. "No," Rose said, moving closer. "Look." The scenes were shifting, changing. Now they showed themselves, Albus in the corridor, feeling the weight of expectations. Rose in the library, terrified of not being enough. Scorpius walking alone, carrying the shame of a name. Hugo trying too hard to fit in, to matter. James maintaining his careful facade of effortless success. "It's showing us what we're carrying," Albus said. "The weight of their history, how it shapes us, distorts us." The mirror's surface rippled more intensely. The scenes faded, replaced by something else. Darkness, yes, but also light. Possibility. Space to become something other than echoes of the past. "I think," Rose said slowly, "it's asking us to see clearly, to see each other clearly, without all the expectation and legacy and burden." They stood before the mirror, 5 students on the edge of understanding something important. The chamber waited with them, patient as stone, old as the castle itself. And in the mirror's depths, their true reflections finally began to appear. The chamber felt larger than it should have been, as though its walls extended beyond what geometry should allow. The light from the stones cast no shadows, creating an atmosphere both unsettling and strangely peaceful. The mirror stood at the center, its surface now showing only rippling darkness. Waiting, patient, neither welcoming nor forbidding. Albus took the first step forward. The platform supporting the mirror was 3 steps up, carved from the same ancient stone as the chamber walls. He climbed carefully, aware of the others behind him, their breathing the only sound in the profound quiet. Up close, the mirror's frame was even more intricate than he'd realized. The 4 metals woven together formed patterns that might have been runes, or might have been something older than runes. Where they joined, the metals seemed to move, flowing like liquid, though it remained solid under his tentative touch. "What do we do?" Hugo asked, his voice small in the vast space. "I think we just look," Rose said. She'd moved to stand beside Albus, her academic curiosity warring with obvious caution. "The text said the mirror reveals truth, shows what needs to be seen." "That's ominously vague," Scorpius observed. But he climbed the steps anyway, joining them on the platform. They stood in a loose semicircle before the mirror, close enough to see its surface, but not touching. Hugo and Scorpius completed the arrangement, all 5 of them positioned, as though the chamber itself had suggested where they should stand. The rippling darkness in the mirror's surface began to change. Not all at once, but gradually, like watching storm clouds gather. Images formed and dissolved, fragments at first, too quick to fully process. Then they slowed, clarified, became scenes they could understand. Albus saw himself at 11, standing before the sorting hat, his mind screaming, "Not Slytherin, not Slytherin," even though part of him wanted it, wanted to escape the weight of being Harry Potter's son in Harry Potter's house. He saw himself in classes, holding back answers he knew, afraid of being too visible, too comparable. He saw himself walking corridors with his head down, trying to take up less space in a world that expected him to fill his father's considerable shadow. "I see it too," Hugo said quietly. "Your memories. Are you seeing mine?" Albus nodded. In the mirror, Hugo appeared at the Weasley family gatherings, surrounded by accomplished relatives, trying to make jokes that would land, trying to be noticed for something other than whose brother or cousin he was. Failing, fading into the background while others shone. Rose's scenes were there too. Late nights in the library, essays rewritten compulsively, the constant calculation of whether she was doing enough, being enough. Her mother's face when Rose mentioned the acceptable grade, that carefully neutral expression that somehow conveyed disappointment more clearly than anger would have. Scorpius walking through Hogwarts alone, the weight of portrait stares, whispered conversations stopping when he approached, his father's careful instructions about behavior, about proving himself, about carrying a name that had been stained by darkness and wouldn't be clean in his lifetime, or perhaps ever. And James. This surprised Albus. James in the prefect's bathroom, his confident facade dropped, shoulders slumped with the exhaustion of maintaining it. James lying awake in his dormitory, afraid of the moment he'd inevitably fail, when everyone would realize he wasn't actually as effortless as he seemed. It's showing us how we see ourselves, Rose said, her voice unsteady, and how we see each other. The mirror's surface rippled more intensely. The scene shifted, moving backward in time. Now they saw their parents, younger, their ages, or close to it. Harry Potter at 15, 16, carrying the weight of prophecy and responsibility he hadn't asked for. Hermione Granger, studying desperately, trying to prove a Muggle-born could excel, could belong, could matter. Ron Weasley, overshadowed by brilliant friends and accomplished brothers, feeling inadequate and trying to hide it. Draco Malfoy at 16, trapped between impossible expectations and growing horror at what those expectations demanded. Terrified, alone, making choices he didn't want to make because he couldn't see any other path. They carried it too, Scorpius said, something like wonder in his voice. The weight, the expectations, they were just like us. But they didn't let it stop them, Hugo said. They still fought, still saved everyone. Did they have a choice? Albus asked. When Voldemort is actually trying to kill you, when the war is actually happening, you don't get to opt out. You don't get to say, I'm not brave enough, or I'm not smart enough. You just survive, or you don't. The mirror showed more now, the war itself, but not the grand battles and heroic moments that everyone talked about. Instead, it showed the small, private moments. Harry crying in an abandoned classroom, overwhelmed. Hermione's hands shaking as she modified her parents' memories. Ron returning to his friends after leaving, terrified they wouldn't forgive him. Draco unable to identify. Harry at Malfoy Manor, making a choice that could have killed his entire family. Fear, doubt, shame, courage that looked more like stubbornness, like the inability to give up even when giving up would be easier. They were scared, Rose said softly. The whole time. They were just as scared as we are. The scenes faded, the mirror's surface cleared, and for the first time, it showed them their actual reflections, but different somehow, clearer, less distorted by the lenses through which they usually saw themselves and each other. Albus looked at his reflection and didn't see Harry Potter's inadequate second son. He saw someone who'd been trying so hard not to be something that he'd forgotten to figure out what he actually was. Someone who had his own strengths, quieter than his father's, less visible, but real nonetheless. Beside him, Rose saw herself without the crushing overlay of her mother's accomplishments. Smart, yes, but smart in her own way. Not a copy or a continuation, but a separate person entirely. Hugo saw someone who didn't need to be extraordinary to matter. Someone whose steadiness, whose loyalty, whose effort to understand others had value independent of spectacular achievement. Scorpius saw himself without the constant shadow of his family's history, not defined by what his grandfather did, what his father couldn't prevent. Just Scorpius, who worked hard, who tried to be kind, who carried pain with dignity, And James. They could all see James now, even though he wasn't there. Saw someone who could stop performing, who could admit struggle, who could be human instead of heroic. It's asking us to see clearly, Albus said, to see ourselves without all the distortion, without the legacy and expectation and weight. Can we? Hugo asked. Is that even possible? Our families are part of who we are. We can't just stop being their children. No, Rose said slowly. But maybe we can stop letting their stories be the only story. Maybe we can start writing our own. The mirror's surface rippled again, more gently this time. The light in the chamber seemed to warm, though its source remained unchanged. Something in the atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably, like pressure releasing, like breathing out after holding breath too long. The enchantments, Scorpius said. They're responding. They felt it together, that wrongness that had been building in the castle's corridors, the heaviness and displaced light. It was easing, flowing toward the chamber, toward the mirror, like the castle was exhaling something it had been holding. The book said the Founder's protections were designed to heal, Rose said, to restore balance. This is what it meant. The mirror isn't just showing us truth. It's helping us release what we've been carrying that was never ours to carry. Generational trauma, Albus said, understanding clicking into place. That's what activates it, not external threats or dark magic, but the weight of history that gets passed down, that distorts how people see themselves and each other. The castle sensed it building in us and responded. Because we're their children, Hugo said. The children of both sides of the war. Gryffindors and Slytherins. Heroes and Death Eaters. All that unresolved tension, all that complicated history, we inherited it. And we've been trying so hard to live up to it, or live it down, or just live with it, Scorpius added, that we forgot we could just live. They stood in silence, watching their reflections in the mirror. The images remained clear, unadorned by the weight they usually carried. It felt strange, lighter, almost uncomfortable in its simplicity, like removing a heavy coat worn so long that its absence felt wrong even when it was relief. What happens now? Hugo asked. Do we just go back to normal? Pretend none of this matters? I don't think we can pretend anymore, Rose said. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we stop pretending. Stop performing being who everyone expects and start being who we actually are. That sounds good in theory, Scorpius said quietly, but tomorrow I'll still be a Malfoy. People will still judge me by my name. Let them, Albus said. You know who you are now. Let them figure it out in their own time. Easy for you to say. You're Harry Potter's son. Exactly. I'm Harry Potter's son, not Harry Potter's clone. I'm allowed to be different. We all are. Rose was nodding. The war ended almost 30 years ago. Our parents moved on. They have lives, careers, families. They're not still fighting it. Why are we? Because everyone else is still fighting it through us, Hugo said. The expectations, the comparisons, the way people treat Scorpius differently because of his grandfather, that's all them, not us. Then maybe we need to stop accepting that, Albus said. Stop letting other people's inability to move forward determine how we live. The mirror's surface began to calm, its ripples slowing to stillness. The clear reflections remained, but something else appeared behind them, not replacing them, but adding depth. They saw possibility, futures unwritten, shaped by their own choices rather than their families' histories. Different paths, different selves, all equally valid, all equally theirs to choose. It's showing us what we could be, Rose breathed, if we let ourselves. They watched in silence. Albus saw himself confident in ways that had nothing to do with being Harry Potter's son. Teaching, maybe, or healing. Something that helped people, but quietly, without spectacle. Rose saw herself pursuing knowledge for its own sake rather than to prove worthiness, happy in discovery rather than constant striving. Hugo saw himself settled, content, valued for steadiness rather than brilliance. Scorpius saw himself trusted, welcomed, his name finally carrying his own meaning rather than his family's stain, and underlying all of it, threaded through every possible future. They saw each other. This unlikely group brought together by shared burden, staying together by shared choice. Not because their families' histories demanded it, but because they'd chosen it themselves. Friends, Hugo said softly. We're actually friends now, aren't we? I think we are, Rose said, smiling slightly. Strange how that happened. Not that strange, Scorpius said. We understood each other. We were the only ones who could. The chamber's light had fully stabilized now, warm and steady. The mirror showed only their reflections again, clear, true, free of the distortions they'd been carrying. They looked at themselves, at each other, and saw simply 5 students who'd figured out something important. Should we go? Albus asked. Or is there more we're supposed to do? I think we're done, Rose said. The mirror showed us what we needed to see. The rest is up to us. They descended from the platform together, that same unconscious coordination that had brought them here. The chamber felt different now, not smaller, exactly, but less vast. More like a room than a mystical space, though the magic in it remained palpable. The door opened before they reached it, swinging silently outward. Beyond, the corridor waited, but the wrongness was gone. The air was normal temperature, the torches burned steadily, the shadows fell naturally. The oppressive weight that had been building for weeks had vanished. They stepped through and the door closed behind them. When Albus glanced back, the door itself was fading, not disappearing, but becoming less substantial, less visible, like it was returning to whatever hidden state it occupied when not needed. It's going back, Rose said, until the next time the castle needs it. Will there be a next time? Hugo asked. Probably. Generational trauma doesn't end with one generation facing it. But that's not our concern. We did what we needed to do. They walked back through the dungeons in silence, processing everything they'd experienced. The castle felt different around them. Or perhaps they felt different within it. Lighter, clearer, like they'd been seeing through clouded glass, and someone had finally cleaned it. Other students appeared as they climbed toward the inhabited areas, 7th years heading to common rooms, a prefect making rounds, a couple sneaking away from somewhere they probably shouldn't have been. Normal castle life, ordinary evening activities. At the entrance hall, they paused, preparing to separate to their respective common rooms. Tomorrow, Rose asked. Same table in the library. We still have homework, Scorpius said, almost smiling. And OWLs to prepare for. Same table, Albus agreed. But maybe we actually study this time. Maybe, Hugo said, but probably not entirely. They separated with quiet goodnights, heading their different directions. Albus climbed toward Gryffindor Tower with Hugo beside him, neither speaking, both comfortable with silence. The fat lady admitted them with her usual commentary about punctuality and proper hours. The common room was still half full, students finishing homework, or talking, or simply existing in that comfortable late evening way. James looked up from where he sat with his friends. His eyes met Albus's, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding. James didn't know what had happened, but he knew something had. His expression asked the question. Later, Albus mouthed. James nodded and returned to his conversation. Albus settled into a chair by the fire, pulling out homework he'd neglected. But his mind wasn't on transfiguration or potions or any of the ordinary concerns that would fill his days going forward. He thought instead about the mirror, about clear reflections and possible futures, about 4 other students who'd become friends through shared understanding, about the weight they'd carried and the choice to finally set it down. Outside the windows, night deepened over the grounds. The castle settled into its familiar nighttime rhythms, students heading to dormitories, portraits murmuring to each other, the building breathing its ancient, patient breath. And somewhere in the dungeons, a door that wasn't quite there anymore held a mirror that had done what it was designed to do: heal, restore balance, help the next generation understand they could be something other than echoes of the last. The work wasn't finished. Tomorrow would bring the same expectations, the same comparisons, the same weight of history. But now they knew it for what it was. History, not destiny. Their parents' story, not theirs. And that made all the difference. Breakfast arrived with pale November light, filtering through the great hall's enchanted ceiling. The usual morning sounds filled the space. Conversations overlapping, dishes clattering, owls swooping in with the post. Albus sat at the Gryffindor table between Hugo and a 4th year whose name he could never remember, eating porridge that had gone slightly cold while he'd been distracted. Across the hall, Rose sat with the same group of 5th year girls she always sat with. But something about her posture had changed, less rigid. She laughed at something one of them said, the sound genuine rather than performed. When she caught Albus's eye, she smiled slightly and returned to her conversation. Scorpius sat at the Slytherin table in his usual position, neither prominently placed nor obviously isolated, but he looked different too, more present somehow, less like he was trying to take up minimal space. A younger Slytherin asked him something about potions homework, and Scorpius answered without the careful neutrality he usually maintained. His expression almost relaxed. James appeared late, sliding into a seat with his friends amid laughter about something that had happened in their dormitory. He grabbed toast and pumpkin juice while contributing to the story, but his eyes found Albus's. The question from last night remained unasked, but acknowledged. Albus gave a small nod. Later, and James seemed satisfied with that. The morning proceeded as mornings always did. Students finished eating and dispersed to their first classes, gathering books and parchment, complaining about early lessons and incomplete homework. The great hall gradually emptied, leaving only stragglers and those with free first periods. Albus had herbology. He walked to the greenhouses with Hugo and several other Gryffindors, their conversation turning to the upcoming Hogsmeade weekend and whether the weather would hold. The grounds were still frozen from last night's frost, grass crunching underfoot, their breath visible in the cold air. Professor Longbottom was already in Greenhouse 3, preparing the day's lesson on venomous tentacular care. He greeted them with his usual warm but slightly distracted manner, too focused on ensuring proper safety equipment to notice much else. The lesson proceeded normally. Albus worked with Hugo, carefully pruning the thrashing plant while avoiding its fangs. Around them, other students performed the same task, with varying degrees of success and nervousness. "You seem different today," Hugo said quietly, holding the plant steady while Albus made a cut. "Do I?" "Yeah, less." Hugo struggled for the word. "Less like you're apologizing for existing." Albus considered this while moving to the plant's other side. "Maybe I am different. A bit." "Good different?" "I think so." They finished the pruning and cleaned their equipment in companionable silence. Professor Longbottom examined their work, nodded approval, and moved on to help a pair of Hufflepuffs whose plant had gotten loose and was attempting to eat someone's bag. Transfiguration followed. Herbology. Rose sat near the front as always, but today she didn't spend the minutes before class reviewing her notes 3 times. Instead, she talked with the girl beside her about something unrelated to schoolwork. Her textbook closed on the desk. Professor McGonagall, older now, her hair more grey than black, but still formidable, began the lesson on conjuration principles. Rose took notes, but didn't fill 3 extra parchments with supplementary observations. She answered when called upon, her responses accurate and complete, but not embellished with additional information designed to prove comprehensive understanding. When McGonagall assigned the homework, 2 feet on conjuration theory, Rose wrote down the assignment and didn't immediately begin planning how to exceed expectations. 2 feet would be 2 feet. Adequate was adequate. The world wouldn't end if she simply met requirements rather than surpassing them. The girl beside her noticed. "You feeling okay?" "Fine," Rose said. "Why?" "You just seem, I don't know, different. Calmer, maybe?" Rose smiled. "Maybe I am." Scorpius had defense against the dark arts with a mixed group of 5th years from all houses. He usually sat alone, having learned that attempting to join others often resulted in awkward shuffling and forced politeness. Today, he took his usual seat, expecting the usual isolation, but Albus Potter slid into the seat beside him, setting his bag down with casual ease. "This seat taken?" Albus asked, though he'd already sat. "Apparently not," Scorpius said. Around them, other students noticed. Whispers started, heads turning. Albus ignored it completely, pulling out his textbook and parchment. After a moment, the attention moved elsewhere. Not forgotten, it would be talked about later, but no longer the immediate focus. Professor Clearwater began the lesson on Patronus charms, theory only, as they were still too young to attempt the actual spell. She lectured about happy memories and their role in combating darkness, her own silver swan. Patronus occasionally materializing to illustrate points. Albus borrowed Scorpius's spare quill when his own ran out of ink. Scorpius shared his notes when Albus missed something while searching through his bag. Small actions, but observed. By the end of class, the fact of Albus Potter choosing to sit with Scorpius Malfoy had been noted by everyone present. They left class together, still talking about Patronus theory. "What memory would you use?" Albus asked as they walked toward the stairs. "If we were actually casting them." Scorpius considered. "Yesterday, maybe, in the chamber. That moment of understanding, That felt like the opposite of darkness. Yeah, Albus agreed. Mine too. The five found themselves at their usual library table that evening without explicitly planning it. Rose arrived first, spreading books across the surface out of habit, before remembering she'd decided to study less compulsively. She consolidated them into a smaller area, leaving room for others. Hugo appeared next, followed by Scorpius. Albus came last, having stopped to talk with James first, a conversation that had been overdue but necessary. James had listened to an abbreviated version of events, asked surprisingly insightful questions, and seemed to understand more than Albus had expected. So, Rose said when they were all settled, back to normal. Is this normal now? Hugo asked. The five of us studying together? Why shouldn't it be? Scorpius said. We all have OWLs to prepare for. They opened their books and began working. The library's evening quiet wrapped around them, familiar and comfortable. Madame Pince made her rounds, less disapproving than usual, perhaps because they were actually studying this time rather than researching ancient magical artifacts. They worked in silence for a while, the scratch of quills and turn of pages creating a gentle rhythm. Outside the windows, darkness gathered early as November evenings did. The torches along the walls brightened in response, their light warm against the cold pressing in from outside. I told my mother I'm not doing the extra. Transfiguration essay, Rose said eventually, not looking up from her work. The others glanced at her. What did she say? Hugo asked. She said that was fine, that I should focus on required work and not exhaust myself with optional assignments. Rose looked up, something like relief in her expression. I think she meant it. Maybe she's been waiting for you to stop pushing yourself so hard, Albus suggested. Maybe. They returned to their work. A few minutes later, Hugo spoke. I quit trying out for things I'm not good at. Decided I'm fine being decent at everything rather than exceptional at anything. That's probably wise, Scorpius said. It feels like giving up. It's not, Rose said firmly. It's being realistic about your strengths. Which are? Hugo asked, genuinely curious. Rose considered. You're steady, loyal. You see when people are uncomfortable and try to help. Those matter more than being brilliant at transfiguration. Hugo looked simultaneously embarrassed and pleased. Thanks. The evening progressed. Students came and went around them, the library slowly emptying as curfew approached. They packed up when Madame Pince started making her pointed closing time sounds, gathering books and parchment with the comfortable efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. The walk back to the entrance hall felt different than it had weeks ago. They talked more easily now, comfortable silences interspersed with casual conversation. No weight pressing down, no wrongness in the corridors. Just 5 students walking through an ancient castle on an ordinary evening. They separated at the entrance hall as always, heading to their respective common rooms with quiet goodnights and plans to meet tomorrow. Albus climbed to Gryffindor Tower with Hugo, neither rushing. Other students passed them going both directions. The normal traffic of evening in Hogwarts. The portraits along the walls murmured their usual conversations. A suit of armor creaked as they passed, adjusting its stance in the way armor did, unremarkable and expected. The common room was warm and crowded when they entered, filled with students finishing homework or simply talking. James sat with his friends, but waved Albus over when he noticed him. Albus hesitated, then crossed the room. "Figured it out?" James asked quietly. "Yeah, I think so." "Good." James smiled, genuine rather than performative. "You look better. Less like you're carrying something heavy." "I was. I'm not anymore." James nodded, understanding. He didn't ask for details, seemed to recognize that some things belong to the person who experienced them. "Want to play chess? I have time before rounds." Albus considered. He had homework still unfinished, essays to write. But James was offering something, not pity or obligation, but actual interest in spending time together. Brothers rather than competitors. "Yeah," Albus said. "I'd like that." They set up the board while James's friends made space. The game proceeded with casual conversation. James's pieces swearing colourfully at Albus's moves. Other students drifted over to watch, offering unhelpful advice. It felt normal, comfortable, like something they should have been doing all along but hadn't until now. Albus lost eventually. James was better at chess, but he didn't mind. They packed up the pieces and James headed off to prefect rounds, leaving Albus by the fire with his still unfinished homework. He pulled out his defense against the dark arts essay and began writing. The words came more easily tonight, less burdened by the constant calculation of whether they were good enough, impressive enough, worthy enough. They were just words, forming into sentences, adequate for the assignment's requirements. Through the windows, full darkness had settled over the grounds. The castle's windows glowed against it, warm points of light scattered across stone. Somewhere students were studying, sleeping, talking, living their ordinary, magical lives. Somewhere in the dungeons, a door that was barely there held a mirror that had done its work. The enchantments had settled, the wrongness dispersed. The castle breathed its normal rhythms again, ancient and patient, and no longer needing to heal what had been damaged. The war had ended almost 30 years ago. Their parents had moved forward, built lives, raised children. And now, those children had finally learned they could move forward too, carrying history but not trapped by it, honoring the past while creating their own futures. Albus finished his essay as the common room slowly emptied. Other students headed to bed, calling good nights, making plans for tomorrow. The fire burned low, its light dimming but still warm. He packed up his things and climbed to his dormitory, where his roommates were already settling in. Changed into sleep clothes, got into bed, pulled the curtains against the dying firelight from below. Tomorrow would bring classes and homework and all the ordinary struggles of being a fifth year preparing for OWLs. There would still be expectations, still comparisons, still the complicated legacy of being Harry Potter's son. But he knew now what he hadn't known before, that he could be Albus without apologizing, that friendship could grow from unlikely places, that the weight he'd been carrying wasn't his to carry, and he could set it down whenever he chose. The castle settled into its nighttime quiet around him. Somewhere Rose was reading, Scorpius was sleeping, Hugo was already snoring softly, James was finishing his rounds. Life at Hogwarts continued, ordinary and beautiful and exactly as it should be. And that, finally, was enough.